So I'm going to be talking to you about a series of studies, two projects in particular, looking at contextual influences on cannabis demand. So these are laboratory-based studies and crowdsourcing-based studies that we've been doing at the University of Kansas. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm fortunate to receive some funding from both federal, university, and independent agencies here. So I'm going to first introduce the idea of contextual influences on demand. Conveniently, I don't have to introduce the idea of the marijuana purchase task or cannabis demand because Dr. McKillop did that for us. Then I'm going to tell you about two studies in my lab. The first one is looking at cannabis-related cues and upcoming activities and its impact on demand. And then the second is looking at a variety of what we call next-day responsibilities and how that impacts valuation of cannabis, and then wrap up with some summary and future directions. So the main point to make here is that substance use in general, and cannabis use is part of that, obviously, happens in a context. And so there's going to be factors like where are you, how are you feeling, who are you with, what time of day, what day of the week. All of those things are part of the context that drives whether or not you're going to use substances or not, and how much of the substance you're going to choose to use in that moment. And conveniently, this notion of behavioral economics provides a framework for investigating individual differences and fluctuations in demand or the valuation of a substance, in this case cannabis, and then how that valuation is impacted by these contextual influences. So most of the literature that Dr. McKillop shared with us was kind of at this trait level. So general patterns of an individual's reinforcing value of cannabis or other substances, and their general pattern, their general demand curve. And so as the paper that he alluded to showed, there were associations with quantity frequency, cannabis problems, in particular cannabis use disorder at that trait level. But we can also consider the reinforcing value of substances at the state level. And so when we're talking about the state level here, we're talking about some of these contextual factors like where are you, who are you with, etc., but also your internal and external influences on your state. So whether that's if you're experiencing acute craving, if you've under the influences of various substances, what are your mood states, etc. And if you're interested in some of this work, Sam Acuff, as well as Dr. McKillop and myself, wrote a paper where we looked at a systematic review and meta-analysis of some of these findings, particularly for alcohol at that time, but there's more studies now that have been done since then. And so the marijuana purchase task that Dr. Lorraine Collins pioneered and Liz Aston really has moved in some new directions as well, essentially, as James mentioned, asks the question, if cannabis or marijuana costs a certain amount of money, how much would you consume? But as his meta-analysis alluded to, it's not that simple in terms of, there's so many parameters that you can look at. One of the parameters is what's the unit of purchase and what's the time interval. So are you purchasing grams over a typical week? That would be more of a trait-based assessment. Or how many hits or puffs right now? And some of the qualitative work by Dr. Aston suggests that this hits and puffs is kind of a weird commodity for participants. They don't always like it, but it's really amenable to doing state-based purchase tasks. So these types of state-based purchase tasks have been shown in research to be sensitive to the presence of cannabis-related cues, some work by Jane Metrick and colleagues, the presence of a next-day responsibility, specifically a job interview happening the next day by Aaron Ferguson and colleagues, and then Sam Acuff did some work looking at whether or not you are currently alone or with peers, and how that influences your demand for cannabis. And so my lab has taken this up a bit in two studies. So the first one was led by my PhD student, Brandon Miller. This was his master's thesis, and it was very generously funded by the Society for Association for Behavior Analysis. And he was very lucky to have this just published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence very recently. So studies have shown that substance-related cues can increase demand for alcohol, tobacco, and in one study, cannabis, as well as an upcoming driving requirement. So if I tell you you have to drive soon, it will decrease your self-reported demand for alcohol. But we're not aware of any studies that have looked at demand changes in everyday situations like having to drive soon or having to go to sleep soon, for example. And so our study aims here were to examine the different effects of exposure to cannabis-related cues on demand for cannabis and adult cannabis consumers recruited from the community, and then also examine whether cannabis use context, so a typical use situation, an upcoming driving requirement, or an upcoming sleep situation, impacts cannabis demand and cue effects. So just the relevant eligibility criteria, there were some other ones, but the ones that are most relevant today, adult participants, they had to report weekly or greater cannabis use. Since the purchase task was framed around hits and puffs, we needed to make sure that they at least had some experience or frequency with smoking cannabis, so they had to smoke at least 50%. And it's a purchase task, so we required at least one cannabis purchase in the last year. He was able to recruit 79 participants into the study, about half female, mean age of about 24, relatively high QDIT score here, and a moderate income on terms of the median income for the year. So in terms of the design that Brandon used, we first had a between subjects manipulation where participants were randomized to either receive cannabis-related picture cues or neutral picture cues, and we were not thrilled with some of the published cue sets, so we spent a lot of time on various open source and Photoshop websites and things like that to find really well-matched images here. And then we did a within subjects manipulation, which was the context. So is this a typical situation that you use cannabis, or are you going to have to drive a vehicle in 30 minutes, or are you presumably going to sleep in the next 30 minutes? And participants received all three of those conditions. They were tested in a neutral laboratory room at the University of Kansas, and this is a bit about the design here. You can see that the baseline and baseline 2 assessments included an MPT and craving, and those were interspersed with either exposure to neutral cues or exposure to alcohol-related cues, and then they received the driving and the sleep context in a counterbalanced order following the second cue exposure. They received 45 images and some pixelated cues, which helped us to check for attention. And our purchase task was how many hits right now from free to $10 per hit. So I'm going to first talk about cue effects, so trying to replicate metric study. And unfortunately, we really found no discernible cue effects here. So the picture cues related to cannabis did not significantly increase demand in the cannabis group and compared to the neutral group. So there were no main effects or interactions, but importantly, we did see an increase in craving. So it does suggest that the cues are having some effect. It's just not impacting the behavioral economic demand. The second part of this is to look at these context effects, so the standard MPT that was done at baseline, and then this this driving and this sleep MPT that happened later. And here we do see a really interesting effect. Is essentially what I'm showing you here are demand curves for the baseline, which is in gray circles. Then we have the driving is the orange squares, and the sleep is the blue triangles. So essentially what comes out pretty obviously, I think, is this typical versus driving context, where if you were told you have to drive in 30 minutes, your self-reported demand and consumption for cannabis was markedly suppressed. And it was significant for all 4 of our primary demand indices, but it didn't interact with cue type. For sleep, it was a little bit different. We only found main effects for elasticity, but a relatively modest effect size. But we did find an interesting cue by sleep context effect for breakpoint and Omax, where participants who were in the cannabis group and were exposed to cannabis-related cues actually showed an increase in breakpoint and an increase in Omax when they were in a sleep context versus a neutral context, and that was not observed in the neutral cues group. So the second study I want to tell you about is a crowdsourcing-based study that was just accepted for publication last week. So we're very excited about that. Looking at the suitability of cannabis, and we used some behavioral economic and qualitative methods. But what I want to emphasize here is this was really a very unique paper for my lab because every single person in the lab contributed to this, all the way down to our undergraduate research assistants doing coding of qualitative responses, as well as our colleague Liz Aston, who's in the audience here, helped us with the qualitative methods. So this very much was a team effort from everybody in my lab. And we're interested here in understanding how cannabis demand is impacted by the presence of personally relevant next day responsibilities. So Ferguson and Acuff looked at this in the context of a job interview the next day, but that's only one type of responsibility. And we have lots of activities that we do on a daily and weekly basis. So we wanted to look at a broader range of those activities and see whether they all impacted demand in the same way, or whether or not there were some that were even more pronounced in terms of their suppression of demand. And then we looked at this idea of self-reported suitability of cannabis use. I'll introduce that in a moment, and whether or not that moderates the effects of responsibilities. So to do this, we turned to the prolific crowdsourcing platform where we recruited 177 adult cannabis consumers. The nice thing about prolific relative to some of the other crowdsourcing platforms is they have a lot of integrity checks before the participants even get into the participant portal. So it's very rare to get like these automated bot responses that you often get on Amazon MTurk. But we did nonetheless have several multi-stage data quality checks to check for attention and valid responses. Similar inclusion criteria as the previous study: adult participants, monthly or greater use, 50% of their time had to be using smoking route of administration, and at least one purchase in the last year. Here we did another state-based purchase task, free to $10 per hit. This time it was in the context of a 5-hour party on a Thursday night, which is what Ferguson et al. Used in their paradigm. And we had a no responsibility condition. Imagine you don't have any obligations the next day, so no work, no classes. And then we had a responsibility condition where imagine you have something in the early morning the next day. And for that, we looked at work, job interview, you're going to your preferred exercise activity, you are responsible for caring for your kids the next morning, and then caring for another family member who was not a kid. So we're getting some sort of occupational related responsibilities, some leisure activities like exercise, and some caregiving responsibilities. So just to jump right to the chase here, what I'm showing you is the results. These are 5 different demand curves for the 5 different responsibility conditions. And for pretty much across all of them, what you can see is that the unfilled circles, the responsibility condition, demand is suppressed relative to the no responsibility condition across work, interview, exercise, caring for others, and caring for kids. But this is at the aggregate level, looking at all 177 participants. And my postdoc, Sarah Weinstock, is interested in this idea of compatibility and suitability of substance use in different activities. And so she devised this question: how do you find smoking marijuana the night before to be suitable or unsuitable? And we gave them some definitions of what we mean by that. And what we find is very interesting. These are the ratings of suitability with cannabis use, green being completely suitable up to completely unsuitable for the different activities. And you can see there's some variability here. A lot of more participants are saying it's completely unsuitable for interview and caring for your kids, but something like exercise or even work to an extent, more people are saying, yeah, it's completely or at least somewhat suitable with that. So if we take this and group the 2 green bars together and the 2 pink bars together, pink-red bars together, and look at the demand curves as a function of those 2 groups, we find something that I think is pretty interesting here. So what we find is that if participants rate it as unsuitable, they show a much more pronounced suppression of demand than they do if they say it is either completely suitable or somewhat suitable. And that's true for work, interview here. When we're talking about caring for your kids, you can see that demand is essentially flatlined. It zeroes out completely in the unsuitable group, but it still is maintained at a relatively decent height here in terms of the suitable group. And this was the same pattern for exercise and care for a family member. So just to kind of bring some things together and summarize for you what we're talking about today. So for study 1, we didn't find any significant effects of cues on demand, which was somewhat surprising given the metric study looking at cannabis-related cues. There could be a few reasons. The metric et al. Study used a lit cannabis joint, so there was probably a more potent perhaps a poor choice of words there, a more potent cue than pictures. And there were a few other methodological differences between our studies. But we did find that an upcoming driving requirement significantly reduced demand. And it appears that there is perhaps an interesting interaction between a sleep context and cannabis-related cues actually increasing demand for Omax and breakpoint. Study 2 is generally a replication of the Ferguson and Acuff papers, but the nice thing here is that we broaden the list of responsibilities to other personally relevant activities that people have, and it appears to be moderated by suitability. And one of the things we like about these data is that it suggests that often we look at demand at the aggregate level. We plot one demand curve for a group, but our data suggests that there are actually perhaps meaningful subgroups of people that have different patterns of influence based on these contextual factors, and suitability is one of those things that could drive some of those individual differences. So just a couple of future directions before I wrap up. We're interested in the interplay of time course of cannabis effects and the timing of future activities. So most of the alcohol literature with responsibilities talk about the next day, because usually that's when you may have, experiencing hangover or other sort of lasting effects. Cannabis is different in terms of the shorter duration of effects and not as often going to have those longer term effects. So we did some qualitative work in this project where participants told us that it was completely suitable because I'm going to be fine the next morning. I'm not going to have any of those hangover or sort of lingering effects. So what we've started to do is actually manipulate the timing of the responsibility. So is it happening soon? Is it an hour from now? Is it 6 hours from now? To see, again, whether this time course of effects plays a significant role here. And then we're also trying to get away from just hypothetical vignettes and situations. So me telling you have work in the morning or you have a job interview or you have to care for your kids, that's fine, but it's still a hypothetical scenario. So if we can actually go into the real world where the real responsibilities and the real activities are happening and the real cannabis use is happening, this will be able to look at these contextual factors in real time in the real world. So with that, I'll just acknowledge the colleagues at KU as well as collaborators and the funding, and thank you very much.